The champagne was vintage, the Porsche was stolen, and the man sitting across from me wasn't my brother-in-law. He was a dead man walking. I realized too late that our perfect family dinner was actually a setup, and my husband and I were the next items on the menu. The champagne at the table cost more than my first car, but it tasted like bitter copper in my throat. We were sitting at L'Etoile, a place where the waiters treat you like royalty, as long as your credit limit is high enough to sustain a small country. Across from me sat Mark, my husband's younger brother. He was leaning back in his velvet chair, looking every bit the self-made king. He had pulled up to the restaurant entrance 20 minutes ago in a matte black Porsche that cost 8 million rubles, a purchase he'd been bragging about on Instagram all week. My husband, Alex, was laughing at one of Mark's jokes, oblivious to the way the air in the room had shifted. I've always been the observant one. While Alex saw a successful brother, I saw the sweat on Mark's brow. I saw the way his fingers tapped a restless, erratic rhythm against the heavy linen tablecloth. It was a manic kind of energy, the kind that usually precedes a crash. Everything about tonight felt performative. The vintage wine, the oysters, the constant checking of his phone. It was a theater production, and I was starting to suspect that the play was coming to an abrupt, violent intermission. Mark looked over at me, his eyes sharp and unblinking. "You're quiet tonight, Elena," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Not a fan of the vintage?" I forced a tight smile, clutching my wine glass until my knuckles turned white. I knew for a fact that Mark had been laid off from his consultancy firm 3 months ago. He hadn't told anyone. Alex was so proud of him, so convinced that his little brother was the family success story, that he didn't even notice the frantic desperation leaking out of Mark's pores. I opened my mouth to say something harmless, something about how delicious the food was, but the waiter arrived, sliding the leather folder onto the table with the precise grace of an executioner. The bill was exactly 200,000 rubles. Mark didn't even look at the total. He didn't even pick up the receipt. He just looked at me, dead in the eye, and slid his phone across the table, his thumb hovering over the banking app as if he were waiting for me to acknowledge something unspoken. "It's a trivial amount, really," Mark whispered, his gaze pinning me to the chair like a butterfly on a display board. "But I think we both know that neither of us has the funds to cover this tonight, don't we, Elena?" My stomach dropped. I realized then that he wasn't looking at me for approval. He was looking at me for a lifeline. Before I could process the threat in his tone, he stood up abruptly, knocked his chair back with a loud thud that silenced the nearby tables, and leaned down so his face was inches from mine, his eyes wild and wide. "I'm going to the restroom to make a very important phone call," he hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying mix of adrenaline and rage. "If the manager comes back before I return, tell him you're waiting for a wire transfer from your other account. Or I'll make sure Alex finds out exactly what you were doing in that hotel room on Tuesday." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. My breath caught in my throat, a cold, sharp blade of panic slicing through my chest. How could he know? Tuesday had been a ghost in my life, a secret, fragile thing buried under layers of mundane routines and suburban lies. I stared at him, my mind racing through 100 excuses, 100 ways to deflect, but his expression wasn't one of doubt. It was the look of a man who held a loaded gun and was simply deciding where to aim it. Without waiting for a response, he spun on his heel and strode toward the lounge area, leaving me stranded in the opulent silence of the dining room. Alex was still chuckling, looking at a stock chart on his phone, completely oblivious to the fact that his brother had just handed me a death warrant disguised as a dinner bill. I looked down at the leather folder. 200,000 rubles. It was a drop in the ocean for a man who drove an 8 million ruble car, yet Mark had effectively turned it into a ransom note. My hands were shaking so violently that I had to fold them into my lap to keep the silverware from rattling against the china. I felt the gaze of the waiter hovering nearby, a polite, frozen smile plastered on his face, waiting for the inevitable moment when the card would be swiped. I took a shaky breath, trying to calm the hammering in my chest. If I called Mark's bluff, he would destroy my marriage. If I didn't, we'd be humiliated, and the facade of the perfect family would shatter right here, under the crystal chandeliers. I reached into my purse, my fingers grazing my own debit card, but the balance was nowhere near enough. My head was spinning. I needed to leave. I needed to find Mark and force him to tell me what he actually knew, to find out how much of my private life he had been stalking. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. "I'll be right back, honey," I said, my voice sounding tinny and foreign to my own ears. Alex just waved a hand, his eyes never leaving his screen. I navigated through the labyrinth of tables, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. I pushed through the heavy mahogany doors leading to the lobby, expecting to find Mark pacing or arguing on his phone. Instead, the hallway was deserted. The air was cool, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and ozone. I turned the corner toward the private lounge, but stopped dead in my tracks. Through the frosted glass partition, I saw a silhouette. It wasn't Mark. It was a man in a dark, oversized trench coat, standing over a slumped figure. My blood turned to ice as I recognized the crumpled, expensive-looking jacket on the floor, the same charcoal wool suit Mark had been wearing all night. I crept closer, the sound of my own heartbeat deafening in the stillness, and peered through a small gap in the door. The man in the coat was rummaging through Mark's pockets with systematic, professional coldness. He pulled out a thick, unmarked envelope, flipped it open to reveal a stack of passports, and then pulled out a burner phone. He turned, his gaze locking onto mine through the crack in the glass, and he smiled, a slow, predatory expression that didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. He didn't run. He just held up a finger to his lips, gesturing for me to stay silent as he pointed toward the service exit where my husband was currently walking out to find us. The air in the hallway felt vacuum-sealed, thin and impossible to inhale. I stood paralyzed, my hand hovering over the door handle, watching as the man in the trench coat calmly slipped the burner phone into his inner pocket. He didn't look like a common thief. There was a chilling, military precision to his movements, a lack of haste that was far more terrifying than any frantic struggle. Behind me, the sound of Alex's footsteps approached, the rhythmic, confident clack of his dress shoes against the marble. He was whistling a low, familiar tune, completely unaware that in the space of 10 minutes, the life he thought he knew had evaporated. I had to move. I had to warn Alex, or better yet, get him out of the building before he walked into whatever trap had been set in the lounge. But as I turned to block the corridor, the stranger in the room pushed the door open just a crack. He didn't step out. He simply tossed something toward me. It slid across the polished floor, stopping at the tips of my shoes. It was a heavy silver key fob, the key to the matte black Porsche that had cost 8 million rubles. "He's not your brother-in-law, Elena," a voice whispered from the shadows of the room, so low it was almost a vibration. "And that car? It was never paid for. It was a bait car. Keep your husband inside, or you'll both be answering for his debts by morning. Before I could process the words, Alex rounded the corner, his face brightening when he saw me. There you are. Mark's been gone forever. Did he go out for a smoke? He looked past me toward the open door of the lounge, his eyes narrowing as he caught a glimpse of the dark silhouette within. Who's that? My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. If I told Alex the truth, he would march in there, and the consequences would be catastrophic. If I stayed silent, the man in the coat might walk out and finish whatever task he had started. I shoved the key fob into my clutch, my movements frantic, and grabbed Alex's arm, pulling him back toward the dining room with a strength I didn't know I possessed. Don't, I hissed, my eyes wide and frantic. Alex, listen to me. Don't go in there. We need to leave, now. Alex frowned, his hand pulling away. Elena, you're shaking. What is going on? Is Mark in trouble? He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over the call button, likely to dial his brother. Just then, a muffled, metallic pop echoed from the lounge, a sound that was unmistakably a suppressed gunshot. The restaurant staff didn't seem to hear it over the low hum of jazz and clinking silverware, but to me, it sounded like a thunderclap. Alex froze, his eyes locking onto mine, the confusion in his expression curdling into a sudden, dawning terror as he looked down at the floor near my feet. There, staining the pristine white marble, a dark, viscous pool was beginning to seep out from under the lounge door, tracing a slow, crimson path toward our shoes. Alex's phone rang in the silence, the screen illuminating his face in the dim corridor light. It was an incoming call from Mark. I watched in horror as Alex's finger moved to answer, just as the door to the lounge creaked open to reveal a pair of heavy, mud-caked combat boots standing in the doorway. The phone screen pulsed with Mark's name, the light casting long, jagged shadows against the wall. Alex stared at the caller ID, then down at the spreading pool of blood, his face draining of all color. The combat boots didn't move. They were rooted in the threshold, the man inside waiting for the next shift in the power dynamic. I didn't think. I acted. I snatched the phone from Alex's hand. It felt like grabbing a live wire, and swiped to decline the call, then powered the device off completely. We have to go, I whispered, my voice barely a thread of sound. Alex, look at me. If you answer that, we are dead. Both of us. He looked at me, his eyes wide, reflecting a lifetime of trust shattered in a single night. The silence between us was heavier than the marble beneath our feet. For a heartbeat, the man in the lounge shifted. The door creaked wider, and I saw a hand emerge, a gloved hand, placing a single, gold-plated cufflink on the floor. It was one of the pair I had given Alex for our anniversary. My pulse thundered in my ears. He had stolen them from our house. He had been inside our home. Go, I commanded, grabbing Alex's jacket and pulling him toward the rear service exit. He stumbled, his mind clearly reeling, but the sight of the blood finally jolted his survival instinct into gear. We didn't run. We walked, with the agonizing, controlled speed of people trying not to draw attention, our hearts screaming. We bypassed the kitchen, pushed through the heavy steel fire door, and burst into the cool, biting night air of the alleyway. The Porsche was parked exactly where Mark had left it, looking like a sleek, predatory shadow in the neon glow of the city. I didn't care about the keys in my pocket. I grabbed Alex's hand, pulled him toward our own sedan parked 2 blocks away, and we didn't look back. As I peeled away from the curb, I saw a black SUV scream into the alleyway, blocking the entrance to the restaurant. Men in suits, not the police, not the law, poured out, moving with that same terrifying professional efficiency. We drove for hours, heading toward my sister's cabin in the mountains, the silence in the car thick with everything we hadn't said. Alex finally broke it near dawn. "The cufflink," he murmured, staring out at the rising sun. "How did he get it?" "He didn't just borrow money, Alex," I said, my voice steadying at last. "He borrowed our entire identity. He's been living in the shadows of our accounts, our home, and our secrets for months. And tonight, the people he was really playing with came to collect." I reached into my bag and pulled out the key fob to the Porsche. I threw it into the passing woods as we sped over a bridge. The car, the 8 million ruble symbol of status, was nothing more than a decoy, a ticking time bomb meant to explode in our lives. We didn't go back. We abandoned our home, our jobs, and the life we had carefully curated. 6 months later, I sat in a small cafe in a coastal town, sipping coffee that tasted like freedom. A headline in a discarded newspaper caught my eye. "Investigation into missing local businessman yields no leads. Luxury vehicle found abandoned at airport." I tore the page out and fed it into the shredder behind the counter. Mark was a ghost. A cautionary tale of greed that had almost dragged us into the abyss. I turned to see Alex walking toward me, his hand resting on my shoulder, his grip firm and real. We were nobodies now, living in the margins, and for the first time in years, the silence in our lives wasn't a warning, it was a promise. I watched the ocean tide roll in, washing away the prints of the past, knowing that the only thing we had truly lost was the illusion that anyone is ever safe when they're chasing a life they can't afford.